I want to talk a lot today about the where we are in this country and where we're headed. And I know I've been on that topic a little bit. Oh, by the way, one last point back to our friend Burnell Trammell. You have to think about this fact for a second. This was a black activist in Milwaukee carrying around signs, "Vote for Trump." Dreadlocks. I mean, he looked like he belonged in the community, very dreadlock kind of guy. But the other point about what I want to say on this in the first five was the idea that none of the mainstream media have covered this death. Not CNN, MSNBC, Washington Post, New York Times. Silent about what seems to many to be an execution-style killing. He literally sitting there, drive-by, and shot and killed. And so I'm glad there are some people who actually care in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and urging the federal government to investigate that. But not a lot of noise out of the media, who make so much of a claim that they really support Black Lives Matter, because when it comes down to it, it's not really that Black lives that matter all to them, only certain Black lives, and frankly isn't really Black lives at all. It's a left-wing agenda that they are pushing. Now I want to turn and talk though about this day is it's a funny thing. I go through times, and you may also, where you're just thinking, I can't figure out where America's headed. I can't figure out how the fall elections are going to come out. I can't figure out what's really going to happen. And I want to say, as I launch into our stories for today, that I actually have a sense of hopefulness about the elections this fall. And let me just say why. I don't think America wants the future the left is showing America they will bring to this country. People do not want this country to turn into a massive Portland, Oregon, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and all the other cities continually being devastated by the anti-American Marxist left under the Antifa, very openly anti-American, pro-Marxist, destroy America, but the movement that has co-opted the Black Lives Matter messaging. And so you have the Black Lives Matter movement, which is, if you read their website, if you listen to the statements of their founders, also anti-American, profoundly Marxist, simply using race as an issue to manipulate America. But I'll give you some examples about this. So Jerry Nadler, who is a member of Congress, I meant to look up, 20 years at least, long time, Gerald Nadler has been a member of the U.S. Congress. And so he made a statement recently I want to share with you in just a moment. But first I want to ask Matt the Wonderful. I sent him a clip of something that happened inside Portland. And if you know, Portland has been one of the places where the Antifa, Black Lives Matter, anti-American, pro-Marxist rioters have been destroying the city. And they did something recently there. The ongoing rioters did something recently, which was there was a federal building, and they realized that actual federal officers were inside the building. So these rioters, looters, property destroyers, these are not peaceful protests. These are violent people motivated by Antifa, motivated by the Marxist destruction of America. They realized that there were federal officers inside a federal building, and they literally tried to jam the doors shut, use plywood, and light the building on fire, recognizing people were inside. So we have that clip. That is from from Portland. Matt, I labeled it Portland Setting Fire. I want to show you what they're actually doing in the ground in Portland. Fire on the plywood there.
You're taking a stand on the wrong side. I've already made a mistake. I've already made a mistake. I'm telling you.
Okay, so you understand, intentionally barricading closed a federal building, realizing federal officers were inside, and trying to light the building on fire. This is the kind of conduct that these Portland, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, anti-American Marxists are engaging in all over this country. If you've noticed, by the way, the media has kind of backed off from reporting all the violence. I think in some ways what the media is trying to do is, because President Trump has been saying, I'm going to send in troops. We're not going to let you destroy the country. And when the media doesn't report on the ongoing widespread violence, when they don't report on it, the average Joe who doesn't pay much attention to the media says, well, how come Trump is why would he do that? Everything seems calm now. You know, we kind of got past those protests. Everything's fine. And Trump is agitating. Trump is trying to create problems. No, President Trump is responding to the conduct of people on the ground, like you just saw in Portland, trying to burn a building with federal officers inside. Which takes us to Gerald Nadler, who was also the one, we talked about him at great length during the time that the Democrats attempted to impeach President Trump over doing nothing wrong with respect to the Ukraine, even when the Democrats knew that what they accused Trump of doing was what Joe Biden actually did on national television, and anyone can watch it and hear it. They tried to use that as a basis to remove the president. Didn't work, but Nadler is a nasty, mean-spirited leftist, been a member of Congress from upstate New York, or from New York for decades. But someone happened to catch Nadler in the streets of Washington, just had a camera rolling just to ask him a question. I want to ask Matt the Wonderful to play that. This is that little clip of Gerald Nadler talking to someone in New York.
It is true. There's violence across the whole country. Do you disavow the violence from Antifa? That's happening in Portland right now? There's riots.
That's a myth that's being spread only in Washington, D.C.
About Antifa in Portland?
Yes.
Sir, there's videos everywhere online. There's fires and riots. They're throwing fireworks at federal officers. DHS is there. Look online. It gets crazy, Mr. Nadler.
Wow, so he thinks it's fake news.
Antifa's a myth.
Yeah, Antifa's a myth in Portland. Meanwhile, the whole city is on fire, and they're trying to burn down the courthouse. But, you know.
Okay, folks, I love when that happens. That was something that Andrew Breitbart used to push. Andrew Breitbart, sadly passed away very young, but he kind of started the movement of saying, you have to create the news. You can't wait till a reporter comes to tell you, hey, X happened, and then respond. You can create the news by being ready with your camera, ready with your question, be the places you want to be, talk to people yourself. So these young people, I don't know who they are, but they caught Gerald Nadler, sitting around waiting for his car to pick him up. And he actually said, the riots in Portland are a myth. That means a lie. He's saying that's not really happening. And I got to thinking about why he would say that. Why would he, of all the absurdities, to say that the violence in Portland is a myth is among the most absurd things you could say. And anyone in America paying attention realizes it is not a myth. It's actually happening, destroying buildings, destroying property, and at the clip you just saw before this, trying to burn a federal building with federal employees inside of it. That is what is happening in Portland. Gerald Nadler calls it a myth. But I mentioned a moment ago about all the other cities where these things are happening. And the media is deciding, I think, not to cover it very much because they recognize, in fact, there are hints now from the Democrat Party. They're starting to realize that the pictures America is seeing on the television, whether they're watching it news or they're watching it online, they're realizing, wow, this is happening in Democrat cities, and no one in the Democrat Party will condemn it. And I'm going to get to a moment of the point on that, but just when I mentioned how the media won't cover this, we have ongoing violence in at least the following cities. You barely hear a peep out of the media now about it. Seattle, Atlanta, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Boston, Philadelphia, Denver, Los Angeles, San Jose, Oakland, Tucson, Sacramento, Phoenix, and Kansas City, Missouri. At a minimum, those places still dealing with Antifa violence, and the media is recognizing, whoa, this is a little bit, this might alarm people. The Democrat media mob, the Democrats in bed, or the media in bed with the Democrats, just not wanting to put anything out there that might upset Americans in their hopeful support, in their worldview, hopeful support of the Democrats. But back to Nadler, I got to thinking about it. By the way, someone texted me, thank you very much. He is in his 15th term in Congress, meaning he's nearly been that, when he finishes this term, be there 30 years. The guy has lived his life in Washington, getting embedded in the Democrat Party, in the Democrat politics, and Democrat political world, and he has gone right along. He has never led on a moral issue in his life. He has been led along as the party moves from wherever you would say it was 30 years ago into the radical pro-Marxist party is today. Gerald Nadler, front and center, happy to keep on pushing whatever the Democrat message is. But I got to wondering, how you could be Gerald Nadler. I got to wondering, is he actually unaware what's happening in Portland? Does he actually truly thought it was a myth? He said that's a myth they're spreading in Washington. I don't think so. He's, I'm not saying he's an intellect, but he watches news, he studies news, he's got staff who tell him things. Everyone in Congress has staff members whose job it is to keep them informed. So it isn't that he doesn't know, it's that he doesn't want to admit that he knows. And because then he's going to be forced to take a position, such as this is justified, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, everything they're doing is all justified. Yes, I'm right with it. He's not sure he wants to say that, but he also does not dare criticize it. So he tries instead to pretend it doesn't exist. And I make the point very often about how you have the left in Washington, Democrats in Washington, any spokesperson for the Democrat Party, they're always extremely careful. They weigh everything before the words leave their mouths. Could anything I'm saying be possibly considered insensitive toward racial minorities? Could it possibly be twisted and I could be accused of racism? They're very, very careful. The Democrat Party is deeply concerned about trying to hold on to the black vote because they can't win without the black vote. So they're very, very careful about not offending, not saying anything that could even be contorted into something that sounds like a criticism that could be labeled as racist. But it's even worse now. It's worse than that. Gerald Nadler does not dare offend Marxists. The Democrat leadership of the House and the Senate, they know who Antifa is. They know what Black Lives Matter is. Everyone who listens to my shows heard we actually played the videos of the founders of Black Lives Matter saying they're Marxists and they're Marxist trained. We've played the great video by, I think his name is Marcellus Wiley, the guy who was an NFL player, who was asked about Black Lives Matter. He played in the NFL, but he was asked to commentate in a sports program about the NBA and whether or not they should be painting Black Lives Matter on the basketball courts. And he said, hey, I looked into it. I read Black Lives Matter website. These people are anti-family. And he's saying he wanted, this Marcellus Wiley guy, he wanted more than anything to be a good father, a good husband, a good father. He was blessed by the fact of having an intact family unit in his life growing up. He wanted to pass that along and have that for his children, next generation. So this is a guy who recognizes that what Antifa is trying to do is extremely dangerous, extremely detrimental to the black community in America. Marcellus Wiley saying, I don't think anyone should be supporting an organization that wants to destroy the black family, destroy the family unit. In fact, Black Lives Matter and its Marxist agenda committed to the destruction of the intact family unit. And so Marcellus Wiley points this out. But back to Gerald Nadler, what I'm getting at is Gerald Nadler could not even admit the truth about what's happening in Portland because at this point, the Democrat Party is so overwhelmed by, and their voting base is so overtaken by Marxism, by the anti-American, Marxist, socialist, communist, call it what you want, the destruction of freedom in America, that those people need the vote of the Marxists to win their elections. They don't dare insult Antifa or Black Lives Matter or any other group trying to destroy this country. Nadler wants to pretend nothing is happening in Portland, nothing to see here, nothing to look at, folks, because he cannot risk offending the Marxist movement in this country. And so if you say that you voted Democrat in our country historically because you always thought they were for the little guy or because you thought they really would support unions, you have to recognize a vote for any Democrat in this country today. A vote for a Democrat is a vote for Marxism. You have to own that. Nadler just owned it for you. He just told you, I can't even speak the truth about Marxist destruction of our cities because I might offend some of the massive Marxist, socialist, communist base that now constitutes a huge portion of the Democrat Party voting base. He doesn't dare insult them. Similarly, and folks, I'm telling you, the Democrats are getting nervous about this. The media is getting nervous about this, about what people are watching and seeing in these cities being destroyed by Antifa and Black Lives Matter, and their party's getting nervous thinking, shoot, what is it we're going to say about this? And so their answer so far is to say nothing. But I'm going to shift and talk about Minneapolis for a moment. I sent the Matt the Wonderful a clip. This is right after the riots. I'm sure you recall that the first Black Lives Matter riots that started in our country happened right after the murder of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer. I think that was like May 25th. So right after that, obviously massive, massive damage in Minneapolis. I want to have Matt the Wonderful play. This is actually a drone looking at Minneapolis after the riots finally ended. You think this looks like Lebanon. You think this is a war-torn. This is Minneapolis, people. This is Minneapolis. There's no sound in this one, so I'll commentate. Minneapolis falling apart, literally destroyed, burned, and just destroyed and burned. It's a horrific and horrible, horrible thing. But I want to tell you a couple of things about Minneapolis. I mentioned, if you listen to the show very often, you know that I still have a soft spot in my heart for Minneapolis. So I grew up in upstate New York, very, very small town, and but my dad. My parents, blessed by an intact family unit. My parents were, had a lovely home they made for us. My dad grew up in Minnetonka, right outside of Minneapolis. And so Minnetonka is just a little suburb of Minneapolis. Lovely place, that's where my dad grew up. So every year we would go on vacation, which all we ever did was drive from our little town upstate New York, drive across country to Minneapolis. My mom grew up in Iowa, right next door. So we had, literally dozens of cousins. They both had big families. We had lots of cousins to see. So that was our family vacation. We spent 2 weeks in Minneapolis, or Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, North Dakota. We saw all the cousins. It was really fun. But one thing my dad's mom did, so she still lived in the house for many, many years that my dad and his 6 other siblings grew up in. So every year visiting them, my grandmother would take as a treat when we were visiting, she would take my mom, my sister, and me. So it was the ladies out for ladies' lunch in downtown Minneapolis. I remember Dayton's department store. I don't even know if it's there anymore, but Dayton is a big Minneapolis name. So she would take us out to lunch at Dayton's department store. My grandmother's our like girls treat out. We pretty much were. In these summer vacations, we'd pack shorts and bathing suits and, sneakers because it was just playing around with cousins. We always had a nice outfit to wear so we could go out to lunch at Dayton's with my grandmother. I remember also being impressed by Minneapolis because it was a big city compared to the little town I grew up in. So as I say, I have a lot of family there and I still feel, very attached to Minnesota. I've been back for cousin reunions and such. So it really breaks my heart to picture Minneapolis like you just saw in that picture. But you might be saying, well, okay, but that was right after the riots. That was right after George Floyd. I'm sure things have settled down, but allow me to correct that misperception. First of all, I talked to a cousin of mine who's telling me that the main street, Lake Street, looks like a war zone. His expression was it looked like Beirut in the day. But in addition to that, I have a friend who's still in Minneapolis, doesn't live in the city, but she was describing what it's like now. And I wanted to share with you what she was saying. And the reason this matters is, this is the picture of the future of America if the Democrats were to win the White House. This is the picture of the future of America if the Democrats win the White House and the Senate. Everything Antifa wants, everything Black Lives Matter wants, the entire Green New Deal will become a reality. Joe Biden is not some moderate Democrat who's going to lead the party back to the days of reasonable, maybe you think JFK type Democrat who really actually respected private business. Joe Biden is not, he's on his way to senility. He's not going to be, even if he wins and even if they don't replace him, he's not going to be the leader of the country. He's going to be in the basement in the White House instead of the basement in his home in wherever he's from, Delaware. But Marxists will be leading this country. This is the future of your country if the Democrats win. First, I want to tell you about Minneapolis, what my friend wrote. Did you even know that Minneapolis is a ghost town? A good friend works out of a downtown office, remotely mostly, but he goes in twice a week voluntarily. He works 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. He describes no cars in the streets, few cars in the ramps, no people on the sidewalks. He left work yesterday at 5 p.m. Except for the maintenance man in his building, he did not meet a single person all the way to his car in the parking ramp and saw no cars on the streets. Did you see that reporting? I didn't. This is a friend of mine writing this. This is what Marxist anarchists have in mind. They are deliberately creating chaos and mob rule. Civil order vanishes, and they are set up to seize power. This is the way it works. It's a strategy. Progressivism is revolution. When the economy is ruined and the elected government fails, Marxists will be there to bring in the new utopia. Then we can all live in a worker's paradise, as exemplified by Venezuela. And this is how it's done. Bullying, compliance. So when you see those letters of support, remember they need to force the government to put it out. And actually there was another whole story about how the government was trying to force people. This it went off. She actually went off and talking about the orders to wear masks. But in a particular locality, one of the tricks they did in getting the people to go along with masks is the government pre-wrote letters and gave them out to businesses and said, hey, when we put out our order about masks, quick pile on and say, yeah, that's what we want. We really do. This is all happening in Governor Tim Walz, the Minnesota governor, in trying to get people to go along with the mask orders. And I'm telling you all this to make these points. What you're watching in Portland and Minneapolis and Denver and all the cities I mentioned is not random. It is not individual people who really got upset about the George Floyd incident and decide they're going to protest until they can bring real change. They have no agenda. They have no demands. They're not saying we're not going to stop rioting until X. They're rioting because they're trying to destroy the country. They're trying to bring America to its knees. When you picture Minneapolis, a formerly thriving and very cool city. Now, it's been leftist for a while, and the Democrats in Minneapolis are particularly radically leftist. I mean, we talked about that, I think, a couple of years ago on this show, this idea that in the just history of Minnesota, the Democrat Party really very early on was radically overtaken by the communist movement in this country. I mean, the actual communist movement in this country. So the party there isn't even really called the Democrat Party. It's got some long name, Democrat Farm Labor, something or other, but it's a very socialist party. So the Minneapolis always had that, but they had the semblance of law and order and a lovely life for many people. But when you look at Minneapolis now, as you're hearing my friend describe, there's no one in the city. There's no one on the streets. There's no one at work. And so you have the country crumbling. Minneapolis has been crushed. And the other thing that's happening in Minneapolis, now being reported more and more, because there's been a violent crime explosion, because once the police have been, as they have in Minneapolis, defunded, so once the police are defunded, there's nobody to maintain law and order, contrary to the promises of the left. We're not saying there's going to be chaos. We're just going to replace the police, the community groups, and we're all going to hug hands and, sing Kumbaya. In the meantime, violent crime is on the rise. So what's also developing, beside violent crime in Minneapolis, is of course, what else could you expect? The lawful citizens are banding together and forming militias. People, this description should be about some third world country where the government fell. This is your country. This is America. This is Minneapolis, Minnesota. This is what the leftists have in mind. We have got to be awake to how radically the left is changing this country, and how every single elected Democrat in the U.S. House, in the Senate, any spokesman for any Democrat in this country, any Democrat leader, not one peep, not a word of criticism about the Marxist takeover happening before our eyes. No criticism. Jerry Nadler's not alone. He's not even going to admit it's happening in Portland. And you cannot get elected Democrats in Washington to say one word, because they need, not just they need the black voting base, they need the massive Marxist voting base that is completely fine with the destruction of American cities and the ultimate destruction of America. It is a radical situation, it is a dangerous situation, and Americans need to stop thinking, well, long as it's not in my city, or, they'll settle down eventually. And the other thing that's just got to happen, my friends, is that we have to have more and more Americans willing to make the honest connection, to connect the dots between the violence in the cities and the Democrat Party of this country, the Democrat Party in Washington, the leaders of the Democrat Party. All they ever do is excuse, explain, and justify this leftist destruction of America. Therefore, they own it. It is their policy. It is their opposition to America. It is their destruction of America. They have to own it. I'm going to say I feel quite sure that when the fall rolls around and we get in very serious campaign season, President Trump is going to make sure that every Democrat in this country on any ballot owns like a weight around their neck the destruction of this country, the unbelievable, disastrous destruction in American cities that Antifa and Black Lives Matter is carrying out. Every leftist in this country needs to own it.